Rosenfield program. So pleased that you can be here tonight, and I'm sure it'll be a terrific talk that we hear by my colleague Leif Brottem. On Monday night, Rosenfield and CLS sponsored a talk by Alfred Fuhr, the person in charge of the European Union's Humanitarian aid program in Afghanistan. Mr. Fuhr, in his talk, as well as in his conversations on campus, painted a picture of what was happening on the ground in Afghanistan in the delivery of humanitarian aid. He emphasized a point which was questioned about on Monday night, that the program and the decisions were not political. He gave us lots to think about, both in terms of the challenges facing those delivering aid, as well as a window on the mindset of those who work in these programs. Tonight, I think we're going to hear something a little bit different. The talk tonight reflects Professor Leif Brottem's research on his recent Harris Fellowship, a very competitive award at Grinnell that supports a full year of research for newer Grinnell faculty members. Like Mr. Fuhr, Leif was on the ground, so to speak, maybe not in the delivery of aid, but he had a close-up look at the mix of factors that mark efforts to address the international migration crisis, European efforts to address the migration crisis. He's going to be giving a scholarly talk tonight, a little different than Mr. Fuhr's, but I think it will give us a different window on kind of the mix of aid and policy. Many of you know Professor Brottem already. For those of you who don't, he is a member of the political science department, but a political geographer. So what that means is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap, but he gives things, he uses a slightly different lens to explore some of the same issues that political scientists do. At Grinnell, he is also chair of the Global Development Studies concentration. A Carleton College undergraduate, Professor Brottem was awarded a master's degree in Environment and Resources at the Gaylord Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin, and a PhD in geography from Wisconsin as well. Among many other non-academic endeavors, Professor Brottem served in the Peace Corps in Benin in the early 2000s. It's the college's good fortune that he started here in 2014, and I'm pleased to be able to present him here to you tonight. So please join me in welcoming, I guess, Professor Brottem.
Okay, thanks Barb, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. It's a busy time, it's cold out. So I'll just start by describing the wall mural, or at least what I think it represents, which are some important themes that run through my talk: migration, legality, national identity, and common humanity. And I took this picture when I was sitting in on a meeting of Malian migrants in their association in one of their dorm rooms. So, my friend Samake, who's a Malian who lives in Paris, purchased this old tractor in France for about 1,800 euros, and he shipped it to Mali. The tractor didn't work, so he hired a blacksmith, and he knew it didn't work when he bought it. He hired a blacksmith in Mali to actually hand forge the parts that it needed, and here you can see the result. It's pretty impressive that he took essentially a moribund tractor and is using it to plow his field, and he's a successful farming entrepreneur in Mali, even though he lives in Paris. Now zooming out on the right, you see the kids playing on the tractor, and these kids are Mali's future. Mali actually has one of the highest population growth rates in the world, and it's actually a sensitive topic to talk about population growth, particularly in Africa, but I'm going to do so anyway, because it's an important factor in what I'm talking about, and it's an important factor when we think about at least West Africa and what its future is likely to hold. In the second video, you can see that once they've grown up a little bit, they work for their dads and uncles, the ones who made these videos and who you can hear talking. And this is another important part of the story between Europe and Africa. These guys need jobs. They also want to get the heck out from under their elders' thumbs. And this is a big, and perhaps the biggest reason why young Malians continue to migrate, which has contributed to the humanitarian situation on Europe's southern border and in northern Africa. So broadly speaking, demography and underdevelopment in sub-Saharan Africa are making migration to Europe more appealing to young people, but political changes in Europe is making it more difficult, nearly impossible to do so legally. So the situation has become a recurring humanitarian crisis with important development dimensions, which I'll focus on and compare with the situation at the US border. And here you can see some eye-opening numbers about the distribution of young people around the world. I'm actually going to try to use this. Can I just switch that on? Does that work? Perfect.
You might have to go off occasionally.
Okay. Is there? All right. But first, I just want to acknowledge who and what made this research possible, especially the generosity of the Harris family and of Grinnell College, the warm welcome from my host institution in Paris, the Center for Population and Development, and innumerable individuals who share their time and knowledge and experiences with me. So this presentation will discuss the ways in which development, efforts to reduce poverty, but specifically those that aim to create jobs, become instrumentalized in political efforts to reduce the flow of people attempting to enter the European Union, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa. So the European Union, with the government of France playing a leading role, is putting tens of millions of dollars into efforts to create jobs for would-be migrants in an attempt to keep them from coming. Now, it would make perfect sense that successful entrepreneurs like my friend Samake that I showed earlier, who live in Europe and have businesses in Africa, would be the logical beneficiaries of such programs. But the reality is that public institutions that allocate development funding and small businessmen like Samake are like ships passing in the night, or even moving in the same direction, but completely unaware of one another. One of the main lessons of my fieldwork is that there's a fundamental difficulty with current efforts to promote job-creating investment, and that difficulty stems from the tension between collective and individual initiatives and the influence of public sector actors with competing agendas. I conclude by arguing that the programmatic outcomes of these efforts actually support the widespread criticism, that development really functions largely as political cover for keeping migrants out of Europe. And I didn't necessarily think that when I started this project. More specifically, the narrative of poverty as a driver of migration deflects attention from the root causes of clandestine, illegal migration, which automatically becomes a problem that can be solved with an actionable solution, rather than a symptom, or even effect, if you will, of changes in the relationship between Europe and Africa that have been occurring over the past half century. And I do not have any kind of specialized knowledge about the crisis at the US border or that part of the world. I see important similarities between how situations are discursively framed and how poverty is deployed as a cause, with development as the solution, all with the broader effect of legitimizing anti-immigration policies. So we hear about the rickety rafts, and we see images of them capsizing the Mediterranean or the Atlantic Ocean, people dying in the Sahara Desert as they try to reach the Promised Land. And it's hard not to think that it must be a crisis. And there is clearly that element. But the crisis narrative, of course, can distract us from clear understanding and, more importantly, effective policy. So according to the Pew Research Center, at least 1 million sub-Saharan Africans moved to Europe since 2010. And the number of international migrants, people migrating internationally from sub-Saharan Africa, has increased over the past decade much more than at any other time. And although overall deaths in the Mediterranean have declined, which is what you see here, the crossing has become even deadlier if it's measured as the percentage of people who actually arrive in the European Union. So the humanitarian crisis is very much ongoing and related to the efforts that I'm going to talk about today. The reason why it's become deadlier to cross is that up until 2015, the majority of refugees and migrants entering the EU entered Greece from Turkey, which is a much shorter and safer sea route, whereas now it's been replaced by a longer and much more dangerous route from Libya to Italy. So the idea that development will actually reduce these flows of migration is often criticized for getting the causality backwards. Critics argue that the more development and income people have, the more likely they are to migrate because they have money to actually move, they have larger aspirations, and they want to get out and do something. And the experience of certain countries like Mexico and some of these numbers of African migration certainly seem to bear this out. Although the policies that are being put into place certainly seem like they might reverse that. So the whole idea that this could actually work is definitely based on a shaky premise. But contemporary anti-immigration sentiment is strong in Europe, and politicians are responding to that. It is an incredibly complex issue, and I don't want to pretend that if I had the job, I would fix the problem or find the solution. I have a lot of sympathy for the people who work on this issue, and there's certainly good people trying to do the right thing. So I'm not trying to say that I know what should be done. My own experience focuses on one of the major sending regions of sub-Saharan Africa, which is the Republic of Mali, which you see in yellow here. And Mali illustrates how contemporary migration from the continent to Europe is not easily disentangled from the long history of chain migration with roots in the colonial past, and in the case of France, ongoing post-colonial involvement. Migration is arguably the most important political issue in Europe right now. It is seen as pretty much the principal factor behind Italy's turn towards populist parties in March of last year, particularly due to the perception that other European Union member states abandoned Italy during the migration crisis of 2015. And Italy's political realignment came just weeks after a major migration policy announcement by French President Macron that hardens the distinction between asylum candidates and people who are seeking to escape poverty, defined formally as economic migrants. As in Italy, that policy reflects public opinion in France, where a 2017 poll reveals that 53% of respondents felt that there were too many migrants in the country. Increasing opposition to migration in Europe goes back several decades, and it has cumulatively led to a Europe-wide policy response that involves stricter borders and programs that ostensibly aim to address the root causes of out-migration in countries such as Mali. As a result, migration and development policies have become intricately bound together in Europe, especially in France, which has a large migrant population, strong ties to its former African colonies, and an active development engagement in them. So more than any other country, France has sought to use development as a tool to manage and ultimately reduce migration flows largely from sub-Saharan Africa. So this presentation focuses on the multifaceted efforts to promote what are called productive investments to create jobs for would-be migrants in countries such as Mali. A productive investment is a very broad term that refers to anything that will boost or enhance job-creating economic activities. And my research found that a large array of development projects are funded within its programmatic rubric, and most are only weakly connected to job creation for young Africans. France has been reducing the number of migrants it allows to legally enter the country for several decades, mainly due to high unemployment and more recently, the same kind of nationalist politics that we're currently experiencing here in the United States. So a very similar kind of political landscape there. So the crisis stems from the fact that France and the rest of Europe are not allowing as many to come in, but they're showing up anyways. And the great irony of the current crisis is that the closure of France's borders to migrants from Mali and other African countries put an end to what was essentially circular migration. Malian men would come and work in French factories, go home every few years, and then eventually would go home to retire. With the restriction when restrictions began tightening in the 1970s, they decided they needed to stay put. They sent for their families. When everybody who came later would do so without papers, and they would stay in France for years in the hopes that they would eventually become regularized. The French government has been looking for ways to stop this for decades, ever since, really. And this marked the beginning of the country's in the 1970s, that marked the beginning of the country's 4-year effort to integrate migration and development that continues to this day. And here in the United States, for comparison's sakes, we have no history of linking development and migration the way that they do in Europe. And that, I think, is interesting and an important point when we think about how the US responds to the sort of emerging humanitarian crisis at our border, especially as we start to think about a long-term solution to it. But we do not have the historical foundation that they had in Europe for that. But we'll see what happens. So although the term migration crisis remains contentious, why is it a crisis? Is it a crisis? What are the roots of it? The events that took place leading up to 2015 will be looked back on as a watershed in European-African relations. The fall of Gaddafi in 2011 contributed to an important increase in sub-Saharan Africans crossing the Mediterranean Sea from Europe for 2 reasons. It became easier to do so because border enforcement broke down as the state collapsed. But Libya also became a very dangerous place for Africans, causing many of them to flee. It had been a popular destination because you could work there, especially once it became more difficult to get to Europe. But all of a sudden, overnight, practically, it became a very dangerous place to be. The increasing numbers of drownings, which received widespread and continue to receive widespread media attention, caused the European Union leaders to convene the Valletta Summit in 2015, which culminated in the declaration that the EU would address the root causes of clandestine irregular migration from Africa through an emergency trust fund to the tune of $1.8 billion. The European policy response was amplified by migration flows coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and other non-African countries, and the very high-profile terrorism incidents, the Bataclan attack, and others that made any kind of softening of migration or even asylum policy impossible. And the case of Germany after the refugee crisis is really a case in point in how politically toxic it became to actually think about sort of a softer migration policy in Europe. And the dominant narrative of clandestine migration is that the root cause is poverty, and therefore job creation is a possible answer. And while my observation is that this is not incorrect, its simplicity raises a number of questions. Can the phenomenon be reduced to poverty? Will jobs effectively address that poverty? And if so, how to create the jobs in the places from which migrants are leaving? So the ultimate kind of trick with this kind of discourse of migration development is that mobility is supported for the highly educated, but discouraged for the poor and uneducated. And this is abundantly demonstrated by this French development policy 2013 initiative, Migrants, Mobility, and Development, which is actually a new name given to its existing program that was set up to combat clandestine migration. So now they're calling it a program for mobility, but it's actually based on a program that was designed to stop mobility. But of course, who are we talking about? We're talking about 2 very clear sets of people. People who have the skills that are needed in Europe versus people who are no longer needed there, but who need to go there. So since the strategy aims to place migration and migrants themselves at the center of development policy, it exhorts the importance of immigrant professionals to contribute to the development of their countries of origin through capacity development, knowledge transfer, and so on. Many of the same migrants are also called on to invest in their countries of origins as a way to promote economic development and do the job creation that I was describing earlier. Seen as a key to stopping this migration. So in this way, job creation is discursively linked to what I call spatial fixity of rural Malians and other Africans for whom Mali is seen as a negative livelihood strategy, the result of some kind of failure that can be addressed through development. So this discourse of employment / spatial fixity, it ignores a lot. It ignores the role of mobility throughout West African history, really, but most recently, the fact that West Africans need to migrate in order to pay taxes, in order to pay for a basic necessity. They need money, and they need to migrate in order to earn money. So it's a complete kind of closing off of that reality. So in short, rural Malians need to be able to move, including to distant places such as Europe. Yet the anti-immigration turn in Europe has translated this into a problem that needs fixing. So the spatial fixity discourse, which is very widespread, it's become very pervasive both in policy dialogue, one of those sort of things that you insert, into the document. Officials at multiple levels of government, but even African migrants themselves living in Europe express it in conversation and in their actions. Malians, other Africans living in France, are very anguished about the crisis in the Mediterranean Sea and all of their relatives and friends who have died, who have drowned trying to get to Europe. So to them, it's also, it's a matter of life and death. And so they really do, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense for people in Mali, they really see this spatial fixity, and they even use the term as a way to keep people alive, really. So although the Valletta Declaration that came out of the crisis of 2015 included the root causes of clandestine migration as the first action priority, these causes remain vaguely defined and poorly understood. So without adequate understanding of migration dynamics in history, the variety of causes that are attributed to ongoing migration from rural Mali really end up serving as a pretext for closing the borders in the EU in repressive migration policy. So as some historical context, as I said, this is really inseparable from a long history of kind of a changing landscape of migration in France. The French government initially tried to entice undocumented migrants living in France to return by providing them with grants to start small businesses and to pay for their airfare home. And these efforts completely failed, called aide au retour in French. And it was widely recognized that most of the people taking the money were planning on returning home anyways. Then in 1996, the forced removal of undocumented and mostly Malian migrants from the St. Bernard Church in Paris, which you see here pictured, became a very heavily criticized incident, and it compelled the French to rethink their immigration strategy. And it was a reckoning that the undocumented migrants in France were there to stay, and that what they needed to do was prevent more from coming, and that's what the strategy became. So in 1998, the co-development approach emerged as the French strategy, which shifted from trying to incite those to leave France to prevent, to try to avert future migration from Mali, at least by underskilled Malians, through jobs and development, with a prominent role for the diaspora. And that's actually where the term co-development comes into play, because it's development that's implemented by traditional development organizations, but also members of the diaspora. So the dialogue surrounding productive investment in Mali has spilled a lot of ink and has led to a lot of conferences. The 2016 meeting on diaspora engagement strategies, which was mandated by the Valletta Summit, was the culmination of literally 2 decades of policy dialogue. But still, not much happens for the entrepreneurs who are actually making productive investments. Moreover, the outcomes of these dialogues are typically projects for European NGOs, akin to our own DC Beltway Bandits, who are criticized in their own right. And for those of you who don't know, the Beltway Bandits are DC-based development organizations that capture all the development funding from the US government and then hire subcontractors. And here what you see is the emergence of what I call the migration development industry complex that's funded from and largely based in Europe. The 2016 meeting that I mentioned led to for example, the 2016 meeting that I mentioned led to an information sharing project managed by a Paris-based organization. And in another example, the separate, even though they all kind of sort of have the same name, the Africa-EU Migration and Mobility Partnership is managed by a Vienna-based organization. But these are not businesses. They do not invest or operate in productive sectors of the economy. They're NGOs. And if there's any real interest in creating jobs in rural sub-Saharan Africa, financial capital must be made accessible in those places. It's as simple as that, and that's the first and oftentimes the only thing that entrepreneurs who are trying to work will tell you. But for most rural Malians, the trip to the capital city to go to a bank is unimaginable for a number of reasons. And the fact that obtaining financing for a small enterprise would require multiple trips makes it almost impossible for most people. And this is just an example of how co-development has never really been able to shed its past of trying to get migrants out of the country, undocumented migrants out of the country. So there's always hand-wringing going on. There's always rebranding and proposals to reform, but everybody knows that it's the same old story. So let's see, closer. So when banks do get involved, they emphasize that their goal is job creation. But if you look at their actual activities, they focus on the personal consumption needs of the diaspora members, and there's nothing wrong with that. Indeed, Malians famously send hundreds of millions of euros home each year, and if you study development or you follow development, these remittances that are sent home, there's a lot of hope placed on them. The amount of remittances that flow to developing countries are many times the amount of official aid. But in the case of Mali, and in the case of most countries, a fraction of those remittances actually go to productive activities and productive investment. 80% of remittances to Mali go to consumption and family support. Basically just helping their families meet their everyday needs. And the remaining 20% is invested in various sectors, but the leading target is real estate. So the great irony of that is that agriculture, which is pretty much the best way to create jobs in rural Mali, used to be the principal investment strategy of Malian migrants living in Europe, who saw farming and livestock as a way to retire. But the focus has shifted to real estate in the capital city, and there's a logic to that. In urban areas, it's profitable and it's relatively secure. You can make, if you have renters, you can make money for 12 months out of the year. But there's also something else to that, and that's that undocumented migrants who live in Europe favor real estate because they might get expelled at any time. And it assures them that they'll have a residence and maybe even an income source if they do. So you see an unintended consequence of Europe's migration policy actually undermining its efforts to address the root causes, because it's causing people to spend their money on things like housing in the capital rather than on farms in the countryside. A paradox of productive investment in Mali is that individuals with investment projects in productive sectors nonetheless avoid financial institutions. And this can be attributed to risk aversion and a fear of defaulting on a loan to a financial institution, but it's also due to a lack of trust in Malian institutions. As a result, individual Malians who are making exactly the kinds of investments that national governments and their partners are promoting say a lack of financial support is their most important constraint. So the next section, the next thing I'm going to do is describe several productive agricultural investments that are made by immigrants in Mali's agricultural sector. And these cases reveal both the potential but also the deficiencies of this political focus on job creation as a strategy to reduce clandestine migration. The common characteristics of these entrepreneurs include absentee ownership, a circular migration strategy where you have a residence in France, but you go back to Mali on a regular basis, self-financing, a need for more technical support, and a reliance on paid employment. So ag entrepreneurs that I interviewed reported paying their workers an average of 50 euros a month, which is actually an excellent salary in rural Mali. But to operate a successful business from afar, you have to overcome a lot of technical obstacles. One interviewee started fish farming with assistance of a government program, actually, but he lost his entire investment of $1,000. He hired a local fisherman, but lost all his fish, and he wasn't there. He was busy. He was busy in France working, and didn't really know much about raising fish. Another one where kind of lack of technical expertise led to the failure was a chicken operation that ended before it even began, and that was because the person purchased chicks in Dakar in Senegal and tried to truck them about 500 kilometers to where his family's farm was, but most of them didn't make it. It was just too hot, too arduous. So in hindsight, wasn't a very good decision, but the business never got off the ground as a result. The owner of the chicken farm you see here illustrates really the potential for successful migrant-led productive investments. The individual who owns this one lives and works in Paris in a cafe, while his business produces eggs and chickens for 12 hotels in the Malian capital, Bamako. He acquired incubators in France and employs 3 people to manage egg production and chicken production. And perhaps most critically, he established a personal relationship with a competent veterinarian to vaccinate his animals. Now, his farm is 60 kilometers from the capital, which reflects both the need to be close to his market, but also a desire for him to maintain his distance from his extended family. And that's another complicating factor when we're talking about trying to boost business and create jobs as a way to reduce poverty. That the market logic of such individual business decisions is an obstacle for development programs because they focus so heavily on these kind of community-oriented kind of public goods like clinics and schools. So kind of maintaining that distinction between what's business and what's public is often very problematic. Another one entrepreneur who I know who invested in a community-oriented agricultural cooperative, has been successful at mobilizing finance in France, and he created a nonprofit that focuses on horticulture, received 15,000 euros in 2016 from the regional government in Paris for drip irrigation and a well, and this allowed the cooperative to drill down 85 meters for water, but it was discovered that the water table was at 110 meters. He got more funding in 2016, but it was not enough to finish the operation.
It's kind of going on. What about tourism? Doesn't Mali have some pretty important cultural items from dating back from the Middle Ages?
Yeah.
This is the period I'm thinking of, but it's obviously
Yeah, tourism too. So Mali did have a booming tourism industry until the current crisis started about 5 or 6 years ago. It's kind of dangerous. Its tourism has really collapsed. It's somewhat regionalized. Like certain parts of Mali really benefit from it, and probably the capital does. But other countries have used tourism to reduce poverty, to develop. So that's another possibility, but probably not everywhere. It's not possible everywhere.
Hi, I was thinking when you said the construction thing. I remember thinking in one of my classes we read about how construction was not a very productive sector, and I remember being so baffled because there's this giant construction boom in East Africa where I come from, and I think partly that's because it's in post-conflict society. There's a lot of rebuilding going on, but partly I think maybe it's different than it is in West Africa and East Africa. Is that it's not only that these people are the Somalis that go, who are living in Europe, who are living in the States, are not proportionally not as many undocumented migrants. So at least in my perception, there's a cultural component too, where parents are realizing that they want their second generation Somalis who are living in the West not to be too Western. So families come back in the summer, and that also creates a lot of economic activity in the summer. So they have a summer home, which I don't think addresses Europe's trying to minimize many Somalis who are living there. But my question was how does the relationship between Malians and the Mali government affected by these European economic development that are intended to keep migration low or intended to reduce, like what is the relationship that is between the citizen and the government? Because I, at least in, anecdotally, where I come from, I see that the efforts not to keep young people in the country usually doesn't work, and if you are in, have a lot of mobility class-wise, then those people are much more mobile, and there's not a lot of issue in them being mobile. You can just like look at the people in Grinnell, and no one has an issue with them, but it's more about people who are low skill, who are leaving, and there are all these taxi cabs or like Uber that popped up, and their nickname is Hoyo, which is like a mother saying like all Saints Day, and the rumor is that a lot of mothers buy these for their young unemployed sons, so they wouldn't take the. That's a very long-winded way of saying thank you.
No, I got your question. My mind is racing with the answer. So the Malian government. Where to start? So first of all, it's a very complex relationship between Malians, the Malian government, and the European Union in terms of this issue. The Malian government takes the money for these efforts and kind of plays a very important role as a partner in these hundreds of millions of euros of development funding because it's financial resources for them. However, Mali, like most African countries, I believe, I know for the case of Mali, they resist taking back expelled Malians. So they do not allow, so one of the things that happens is if France wants to expel some undocumented migrants, the country actually has to agree to take them back, and they never do. So actually, as a precondition to this trust fund, the European Union tried to use the trust fund as leverage to finally get them to do repatriation agreements, and the Malian government refused. And I think probably because the EU was under so much political pressure to do this, they were like, okay, we'll do it anyway. So there's very kind of complex relationship there. In terms of expatriates, the Malian government relies very heavily on them to send remittances home to support their families, to be partners here. So they have dollar signs in their eyes when they look at the expats, whereas before democracy they were seen very suspiciously and they were sort of seen as enemies. And so I think that a lot of it is performance. I mean, when I'm interviewing a Malian official, he's going to give me the line about reducing drownings in the Mediterranean Sea and the need to create jobs in these villages, but he or she is probably thinking, we still need people to migrate. Like I think their number one wish would be that Europe would open its borders. I think they're realistic. There's a realization that that's not going to happen anytime soon. So I hope that sort of answered your question.
What about the people who haven't migrated? Like, how do they see the effort? Because the Mali government has to perform and that they are trying to take this development very seriously and create jobs so young people stay in Mali. Those young people don't want to have that job in that village.
Oh, right.
So how do they see the Malian government, like, this public performance that they're trying to create jobs to young people in the country, but the young people don't want to be there because they're very good.
Right. Do they even want to work in agriculture? Right. That's a great question. There is a real movement away from agriculture amongst young people, and I think that I didn't talk to young Malians who live in Bamako, the capital, about this, but I think if you did, they would say like, that doesn't do anything for me, and if it was safe to migrate, I probably would. There's no jobs for us here, and they probably would be operating a moto taxi just like you described. So I think they're very dismissive of the government's intentions and whether the government is really acting in their best interests. They know that the government is not.
I guess I'm just curious. I was reading recently that in a lot of China for the past 15, 20 years has been investing in Africa, and I was wondering where are their investments headed, and what sort of industry or where are they putting their money, and how is that impacting like the situation? How are their models different than how the EU is investing?
Yeah, so why isn't productive investment coming from China? So what China does is they build large infrastructure projects. It's very controversial because they bring their own workers, so they're not actually creating a lot of local employment. If they do invest in agriculture, it tends to be like more of plantation type agriculture that actually has a negative effect because it can displace people. So you hear about land grabbing, just tends to get overblown, but it's a real issue that the Chinese are not interested in doing development. They're not interested in stemming migration, and that's not a criticism of them. They're just there to build strategic partnerships in the world and create markets for their companies and maybe create some jobs for their own people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But so my observation is that it's just the way that they're doing investment in the sectors they invest in doesn't really have any effect. I think in Ethiopia and East Africa, where there's a large population and kind of some industry, and Chinese are opening factories there, I think that's probably a slightly different story, but in Mali, there isn't any of that kind of investment. Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious as to what the capital market looks like for a Malian who wants to start a Malian business. So you mentioned about it being difficult to even get to a bank. But say you were able to do that, and then you actually got your business opened. One, do the banks, the financial institutions, do they have the stability to support, large-scale business creation? Are there the property rights and all the things we have in the United States that, with great difficulty, of course, if you wanted to start a business from the ground up, you could.
Yeah, great questions. The capital markets are not very well developed. There is a banking sector. It's tied more closely to kind of the French financial system, and the Moroccan zone a few banks. So it's much more kind of hierarchical and top-down than what we have here. It's not very consumer-oriented, so it's very expensive and very sort of, it's arduous to sort of get access to it. But when you say capital markets, what you're thinking of does not exist in Mali. I mean, there's no stock market, or very, very small one. It's very hard to get financing. So capital markets are very, very underdeveloped, and there is effort. It's actually coming from the United States, from USAID, to develop better capital markets to support entrepreneurialism. And there's more of a tradition of that in Anglophone Africa, because just kind of there's more of a tradition of that in England and the United States. But I flipped back to this slide because so I went to like a kind of a networking salon event in Paris in June, where it was actually Malian entrepreneurs kind of trying to rub shoulders and meet people who could fund their projects. And I met this guy, and I don't know if you can see it, but he was a former senior financial auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers, so a global, top-tier global corporation. And he left that job in order to become an entrepreneur, and he wanted to start an agro-industrial company in Mali. I emailed him 2 days ago, said, hey, Mohammed, how's that going? He gave up on it. He could not find financing. So that's, I think, the short answer to your question, that it's very difficult. It's very underdeveloped.
Hi, Professor Brottem. I wasn't going to ask this question, but then you mentioned Moroccan banks, and I felt like I had to. So I was just curious because while I was in Morocco this past semester, something that was really interesting that came up in my research was that North African countries, well specifically Morocco, had started making investments similar to the ones that the EU had been making in sub-Saharan African countries, because they too are also trying to curb your migration through investment strategy. That they do so because they're like a host country now, as well as a transit country, et cetera, et cetera. But I was curious, did you see evidence of North African developmental projects in Mali, or was that something that came up in your research?
Yes, I have. There's an increasing Moroccan presence. The only reason why I know that is because I ask people like, hey, who's building that bridge? Who's building that, chicken factory? Whatever things I see that are being built, I ask, and oftentimes it's the Moroccans. It's Mohammed Sank or Mohammed Sis rather. So yes, it's definitely growing. I mean, the Moroccan economy is not big enough to support a lot of investment, like at the scale of China or even Europe. But yeah, but it's interesting to hear that they're now trying the same strategy because what Morgan said is that a lot of the migrants go through Morocco and they get stuck. And actually, as Mali has become, Morocco there in the far west, as Libya has become very dangerous. Morocco, which 20 years ago was the way you would go because it's the shortest trip across the sea, is now people are going there again. And a lot of people get stuck in Morocco for long periods of time, and so the Moroccans want them to go home, right? Yeah.
Do you ever see like conversations for migration from, this is kind of a very wishy-washy idealistic question, but that we can move toward that people have the, mobility is a right, human right to be able to migrate, but it's just a very practical thing that you cannot keep people to move towards where capital is. So if you know what I mean? So I find this kind of interesting because you said something about I can never really see America doing large development projects in Central America. At least Europe is doing something. What Europe is doing is very self-serving. I don't see it as a model that even needs to be invested in to make it better because it's very
Maybe it's worse than nothing.
I feel like it is worse
Yeah.
than nothing because it's not very practical and in a sense, I don't know if this is too idealistic, that people should have the right to mobility, that they should go to places where they think they are going to be better served,
That was the dream of the 90s. I mean, that's the original idea of globalization that I was steeped in as a college student. Free movement of capital, free movement of goods, free movement of people. That's how it was supposed to be. And nowadays, in the sort of kind of post-globalization dystopia situation, we focus on how the free movement of capital has caused so much damage, but we never talk about the fact that the whole idea of neoliberalism was free movement of people. So I agree 100%, and I think a lot of us sort of unrepentant liberals sort of felt for a long time that eventually we would get there, but we're moving further and further away from it. But I agree, and I think sort of undermined my whole argument at the end there, but it is worse than nothing. I mean, that was kind of what I was trying to say, yeah.
I just wanted to add to your point, Heather, that not all EU funding goes directly to the massive EU, not military, sorry, going to military industrial complex, development industrial complex. A lot of the reason that on the ground NGOs by local people for local people even exist is because of EU funding as well. So there's a question there as to whether or not it's affected this sector of developmental aid, and there's also another layer that